All right, let's get started. Welcome everybody. This is our fourth annual UX of Games event, our pre-Comic-Con event that started as 4 years ago as just looking at how is it like to be a UX designer in the games industry. The year after, we were looking into VR, an emerging technology at the time. And then last year's topic was UX design for spectators, looking at esports. How is it when you have players and you have spectators, and how do you design for those guys? And this year we are twisting around a little bit again, and the topic is UX design in the age of super influencers. We have these guys who are your passionate users, or your passionate, you could almost call them citizens, because they are so excited about your product. And sometimes they might have pretty passionate feedback as well on the products that we are building. And before I introduce the panel or the fireside chatters, let's give a big thanks for Downtown Works and Candice here, who are hosting us. Candice, do you want to say a couple of words about Downtown Works?
I'd like to invite you all to come and do a trial day if you're in the mood to co-work or if you're looking for a space, and just come on to the front, and Morgan, myself, or Anna will be there. We'll give you a tour and you can spend the day and check us out.
Cool. I actually want to do that myself. I really like this space. And also, this year is very special because we've been trying to do this event for a few years already with IGDA San Diego. We have some IGDA San Diego members here. Woo! So this is a really nice collaboration between the two communities and starting to do more things together. All right, let's get started. So today, we have here Dan Murray. Really happy to have him here. He's the president of Skybound Interactive. He oversees the company's robust gaming business and works closely with games industry's leading publishers, developers, and investors to expand Skybound's IP to mobile and console. This also includes the highly successful Walking Dead brand, and some people I've been hearing even saying that the Comic-Con event is the big show. So I'm extremely pleased that Dan was able to make it here, because I know this is going to be a super busy week for him. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you. Can I just ask, can we talk about the character here?
Oh, I didn't introduce myself. So I'm the Cuddle Bear team leader. Does anybody know the Cuddle Bear team leader? Okay, I'm also Elina Olila. I'm in the board of UX Speakeasy, the other community that's organizing this event, and a local UX design professional. More about Cuddle Bear team leader. We also have the Funky Ops here from Fortnite. If you've been wondering who is this funky guy here, he's my beautiful assistant tonight. All right, thanks, Dan. Also, we have Larry LaPierre here. Larry is the SVP at Daybreak Game Company, and he has had a wildly successful career across companies in the games industry, such as Electronic Arts, where he was the executive producer for SXX, if you know that game, and woohoo, and Zynga as well. And Daybreak was the leader in the new Battle Royale genre. I don't know how many of you have played Battle Royale games like Fortnite or H1Z1 or PUBG. Any players? Game players here? And H1Z1 was actually one of the top revenue-generating Steam games last year. So a big game and a great company. So let's get started.
Yeah. So listen to my words, Epic. You guys are just keep doing what you're doing. Don't limit me to 500 materials, please.
Oh gosh.
We decided to put a cap on materials at 50. Enjoy.
See that that's my fear of them putting a cap on the materials. If they cap it, let's say 500 across the board, like you're just gonna have a potential situation, man, where a bad player is just spraying you, dude, and like, and you know, and you run out of materials, dude, and like, and then you die, and it's just like, dude, like that would make a good player rage, because you're like, that's the skill god, that is. Like, I took the time to farm 999 wood. By golly, I want to use it. By golly.
So here you have a user of your product giving you direct feedback over the internet how you should be building your product. Does this sound familiar, guys?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you share some exciting stories about that?
Well, I can share that I probably have more hours watching Ninja play our game and other games than I've actually played the game. So, you know, listen, there's a lot to be learned from the interactions, not just his own narrative. Fundamentally, they come from a good place, but they're also entertainers. They're trying to be provocative. They're trying to build their audience, and sometimes it's at your expense, and sometimes it's to your benefit, but it's authentic for what they're trying to do. So that's the slippery slope that it represents. So, you know, and I've at many times Ninja has gone off about different things, and at the root of it, there's a genuine, sincere observation, usually. The trade-offs of how you would solve that and what it would break in other things and stuff like that, there's no recognition of that. There's no dialogue in that, you know, that it represents. And so the thoughtfulness by which you approach engaging with these influencers is the most important thing, the tone of your interaction, because you're never going to control what they do. And if they do allow you to control, they lose their audience because they lose their authenticity. And if there's anything that it seems that people are gravitating to these channels, that they're looking for tastemates. They're looking for people that are authentic, that aren't part of the manufactured marketing message. And that's why it's continuing to build and grow, because they say things that are inappropriate. And so, you know, yeah, it's a huge influence, and it's something that has to be managed. But at the end of the day, it's no different than any other feedback loop that we deal with. Whether it's an investor saying you need to make this blue, or whether it's, you know, you have to listen and understand whether it's really valuable or whether or not you need to editorialize it and stick to your guns.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole community of people out there who, you know, basically this is their career, and this is what actually a lot of kids are aspiring to become these days. So there's no way to deny that, you know, the power that these influencers have, but I think the important thing to keep in mind is that they are, you know, at the root of it, they are creators, and this is something that they're doing to express themselves and to actually build their own career around. So you have to sort of treat that with that kind of respect and actually treat them as equals, just as you would any other creator in any other field.
Yeah, that's actually my 10-year-old Fortnite name is Ghost Ninja XXX. So he's a big fan of this guy. And actually, when I was looking at this video, I realized, like, oh, that's why he's been using lately a lot the word dude, because this guy keeps saying dude all the time, and he's sort of like contagious, and he's getting the influence even that way. Actually, how many of you guys in the audience know who is Ninja? So probably my wild estimate would be about 15%. So Ninja is a guy who actually had the most social interactions in April of anybody in the whole world. And Ronaldo was the second one after him. Who knows Ronaldo here? Who is Ronaldo? So it's really interesting how these things are going. How about some sort of like positive stories about how do you funnel this sort of feedback into something constructive where you might be getting really useful feedback or...
Well, I can speak from our perspective since, so I work at Skybound is more of a media company. We work with game companies like, you know, like where Larry works at Daybreak, but for us, we're not in the weeds of actually doing the design and all the creation of. We do a lot more when it comes to the narrative side, and we do a lot more when it comes to the actual social media side and how to connect our audience and work with influencers to the products that we create. And then actually go one step further and try to bring the creators who are behind those products, like Robert Kirkman, for example, try to put them directly to the consumer and try to connect them. And these people, the influencers, these creators are actually the conduit to that. One of the things, so I have one example of something that actually was a great experience. We built a game a couple years ago here, and we actually launched it here in San Diego at Comic-Con in the baseball stadium, where we ran an event, and there was a game called Super Fight. So Super Fight for us was a social card game that was started by a young creator named Darren Ross, and it was a tabletop game. It was basically like Cards Against Humanity. So the game essentially was a collection of cards made up of characters and attributes, and the whole game was putting those cards together, and those combinations would create an absurd argument. So you'd basically argue back and forth about why your character would beat the other one up in a fight. So, but the combinations are absurd and often hilarious. And the first thing we did when we started working with Darren to take it into other mediums was we actually built a YouTube show. And we did that with Maker Studios at the time. And we put influencers at a table with a few celebrities as well. So we tried to mix it up with some of the Hollywood network that we had mixed with the influencer network. And we just let them play. And we created these videos online. We created a bunch of them. We actually created 2 seasons. And we get millions of views, and they were just funny. And then we built a game with that same premise, and we tried to take it one step further, and actually we worked with a guy named Swifter. So Swifter is another very influential influencer, plays a lot of Call of Duty. But he actually came in and worked with the game development team throughout the process, and that game was just this. It was the same game, but on Steam, and we essentially took 4 streams and spliced them into one, and so that influencers could host their own games and just using vidcams. So it was essentially a vidcam version of the same game, but as an audience, you could actually vote on the winner using some of the Twitch tools that they'd sort of introduced a couple years ago. And so it was sort of kind of generating that whole loop. And my point is that Swifter came in and worked with the game development team throughout the course of the development to sort of provide his own design input to that product. And it was great.
Oh, that's really interesting.
That's a great segue in the context of the journey that we went through with H1Z1 as well. I mean, that game launched 3 years ago now, almost 3.5 years ago. And it was built, literally the audience was built through Twitch and the people that were playing and broadcasting it. And the type of games that we made at the time were very open world, emergent game experiences. That game actually launched as a survival game. It was this session-based experience that we plugged in later on that really kind of got the traction, because it just created a rule set, it created a beginning and an end, and it was very broadcastable. There was tense moments that emerged, and they could talk about them. Wow, how did that happen? And it created a connection between the audience and the content creator. And when I got to Daybreak, one of the first observations I made is that things have changed pretty quickly in the games industry. We aren't just making games for people that play the game. We're making games for people that create content around our games, who are then building their own audience, that are then discovering our game. So it becomes kind of this unity circle of kind of building and growing that's more within your control than traditional marketing techniques and things like that. And social does it on its own, but this is just so personal and interactive that if you provide the tools and you provide the environment and don't script it too much and let it be emergent, those seem to be the experiences that allow the content creators and the players to then have a connection point with your content. And I think we're only just beginning. I mean, I think it's going to continue to evolve, and we have to look for these trends. I mean, I was talking to Steve earlier on as far as what's fun about being in this industry, and it's the how to take all these little data points and have a hypothesis about where the market's going, so that you can be there when it's when you hit that sweet spot.
Yeah, every year it seems. I mean, the game industry reinvents itself like one step at a time, and so you always have to be iterating forward, and that's kind of we think about that a lot at Skybound. Just how do we actually just maybe try to take a step forward and seeing these trends. And actually, what you had mentioned is, I think, super important and kind of reflects on what Ninja was talking about in the game, is that it's essentially a tool set. It's almost like going into somebody's sandbox, with a bunch of toys, and you want to keep feeding them toys to play with, and allowing those stories. And we talk a lot about emergent gameplay and the stories that the player creates versus the stories that we want to tell them. And we're very much a story-driven company, so it's kind of that's a very kind of not an awkward, but it's kind of an awkward approach for us, because we're very driven as a company to tell these stories. But I mean, it's exciting to sort of let the players tell us what they've done and let them tell the stories.
Yeah. I mean, I've spent years in focus groups and feedback mechanisms and trying to get authentic insight. And every time you put somebody in that environment, the peer pressure of the vocal person that kind of dictates to the rest of the room what the opinion's going to be. And then the lag between the feedback. We launch an update, and within the first 20 minutes of it being up, you go onto Twitch and you're kind of getting the live reaction, the good and the bad and the ugly of it, right? And the risk of what you change, and they don't like what you changed, and the risk that you didn't change it enough, and you're living it in a very live loop. And it's very empowering, just like data. I mean, in our industry right now, data analytics and kind of the data will tell you. I spent some time at Zynga. It was all data. And it's very insightful. As a designer that was just driven by intuition and kind of instinct and editorialism, you're kind of blind and you're vulnerable. And then the data comes along and it's like, oh, great, I can support my hypothesis. That's great, And then you have live interactions and all the subtleties of what they said versus what they meant versus what happened at that moment versus what was going on in the chat and what the observations were. Like, you're just overloaded with feedback with regards to how to interpret. But you have to own the interpretation. You have to editorialize that. You cannot take it literally. You still have to put it through that filter, because as we know with design, sometimes it's what you don't do that kind of makes the difference. So.
Yeah, so how do you really balance the feedback bit that's coming from these very vocal influencers, and then the data that your own team is providing in, let's say, from BI or user research, and then the design vision, of course, that the designers, game designers and UX designers have. How has this changed the product design process or UX design process?
I think the most important thing I would point out is that you still have to treat it as feedback. You can't treat it as gospel. You can't take it literally. And you do have to balance it against other metrics that you have and kind of validate that it's a legitimate perspective or not. And you look for more data sources around that. So it's not the end all. But the challenge is that when some of these audiences get as large as they do, perception is reality. And if they drum up a perception that is counter to what you're doing, you have to find a way to have an authentic dialogue with that individual and then explain to them, hey, let me tell you a little bit about game design, or let me tell you a little bit about why we can't do that. And you'd be surprised, and we would bring the influencers, the Twitch guys in on a regular basis. They get it. In fact, they're thankful to get a little bit of, oh, I see how that works and how we can't do that. And then they go back and kind of do what they do. And for some of them, they're in persona. I mean, meeting some of these guys in person, you're kind of like, really? That's, wow,
Yeah, I mean, I think one commonality that I've always found in talking to a lot of these influencers is that they are essentially at the core of it. They are super fans. They really are passionate about the things that they do. And that's why you see many of them gravitate to just certain kinds of games. And then you see the ones that are sort of being used by other companies that are being used as marketing assets. And that you can always tell the difference.
Yeah.
And the audience specifically can always tell the difference. And even more so now, I think there was a big trend in that in the beginning, once everybody saw the power of these influencers from a marketing perspective, and all the publishers sort of rushed in to sort of hire them, and they had agents and managers, and everything sort of like got very real very quickly. But if you go and you meet them personally and bring them into your company, they will rush through your doors to get inside the makings of a game, because that is why they're there in the first place.
To the point that initially, there was some debate in terms of, we made a large effort to kind of keep our relationship authentic in terms of there not being paid, other than access to things and kind of dialogue and stuff. But then all of a sudden, people started getting paid, which, it's their right. But the community backlash, now you see anytime somebody's doing a promotional spot, they have to, in the description, for the most part, put that it's an ad, that it's promo, that it's sponsored, which now gives them the ability to kind of do that for a period of time. But there were some rough patches there that people were getting called out and they didn't know what to do, and because they don't have an agent. And
I think even so we have a partner who has had the negative experience where they've introduced things into the game where they have a really super passionate fan base around, and they completely rejected it, and the whole community was in an uproar. And sometimes it just takes a while to get them back. But I think the message is when that happens, that's because that's not necessarily a negative thing. It means that these people really care, but you have to listen to them. And then when you come back and try to fix it, you have to be transparent about it. Yeah. And you have to admit when you do something wrong. When you screw up, you just have to admit it. And that's where I think the delicate balance is between the two. Mm-hmm.
So we really want to keep this session super interactive. So I'm going to open. We have the first question team lined up here yet already. However, before your question team, I'm going to ask these guys, how do you think, since games is such a forerunner of many things, and you see different technologies and different things like emerge in games before in other industries, what advice would you give to people who are not in the games industry regarding to this phenomena that we are seeing now in games? What to expect, or maybe a word of advice, or
I think that
how do you see? Yeah.
Well, I mean, really, what we're talking about is what are the patterns, and the assertion that gaming is at the forefront of this pattern, maybe isn't accurate. I think that fashion probably could be pointed to as being where the influencers, played a bigger role in the success of brands initially. I think that YouTube and some of the video bloggers and stuff like that, Twitch is literally the last 3 years. And, we don't have the same influence on YouTube as aggregated the way that it is. Facebook is trying to do their live broadcasts within the game space as well. And even they're having difficulty getting, major audiences and stuff. So, there's so many complexities in terms of this. And the trends, if you look at some of those other verticals, you learn from where they are in their life cycle. So we may catch up, we may pass, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, that's a tough question because it covers so many topics. But I do think I'll just speak from our company's perspective because we one thing about our company is it's very young and it's been growing. So we've been sort of building our company through the lens of a game company. And what I mean by that, we've been trying to do things that game companies are very good at, but through a media company's perspective. And that just starts with getting to know the consumer. So figuring out how to integrate APIs in our partners' games so that we have actually a digital tether in all of our games so that we can actually start providing doorways for our fans to come into our community through our partners' communities. And then through that, actually figure out ways for multiple partners to sort of exchange those fans. And that's kind of, I think we're trying to act like the hub for fandom in that regard. Yep. So I do think, and that just from a media company's perspective, and I think there's lots of other companies in different verticals that they're trying to crack that code of how do they get to know their consumer better? What kind of analytical tools actually make sense, and how do they actually do that? And more so, the digital e-commerce side of the world is basically the dominant factor in how goods are exchanged. And so games have always been good and always at the forefront of figuring out different ways to do that. And because I think the advantage that games have is that we are that perfect mix of technology and entertainment, and we also cover so many different devices that we're everywhere. So we are ubiquitous because everybody has a phone in their pocket, and many people have a PC, and many people have TVs and consoles and things like that. So we sort of exist, and there's different versions of where games exist in that in that environment. So I guess my point is that all companies and all verticals can always, I think, look to games as a good sort of a trendsetter or sort of signal caller for where they can maybe take lessons from, and that really comes to connecting to the consumer. So in this regard, like, I don't think there's this isn't any different from fans in sports, sort of voicing their opinions or going into fashion. I mean, all communities have these strong vocal sort of opinionators and influencers within them. So it's just a matter of how to direct those tools.
And with respect to specifically back to the game side of things, as far as what's next, once you recognize that there's this trifecta of an audience that you're making your game experience for, and that the tools you invest in that allow the content creators to do, more interactive things with their audience, it all of a sudden is on the feature list, and you're all of a sudden spending time, fostering that relationship and helping them succeed at that. Some examples of that is that as we found that some of our tournaments, would happen, we started creating second screen kind of rich data feeds that basically was able to, because the action happens so fast and it's live still, and they're not scrubbing it backwards and stuff. So, here's the text feed, here's the standings, and in this day and age, second screen experiences, whether it's on a phone beside you while you're watching, or, it's a natural behavior now. So as you look at that, and you begin to realize that your entertainment experience isn't just what they're watching even on Twitch, that there literally is another window on another screen that could be supplementing that experience with an additional layer of interaction, or a secondary layer of betting, or a secondary layer. Like, this is where this is going, right? And we've built some websites, we've built some things to support some of our tournaments, and we've had really great engagement on those things.
Yeah, I just read an article in the New York Times today about some of these different niche sports that are trying to basically introduce themselves to a broader audience, and as opposed to competing for that time on some of the traditional media channels, they're going after streaming in a very direct manner, and like the arm wrestling folks and karate championships, and like they're actually going out to very specific locations, and it's almost like an adventure show at that point. But it is really about trying to reach people in a very specific way, tailored to what the consumer is interested in based upon what they're actually producing. So,
Tim, now is your chance. We have our beautiful assistant, Funk Ops, here, who is going to be giving the microphone to people who have questions.
That's your prize.
Thank you. So by the way, I think the last comment you made, real-time sports, like every sport could take a lesson from what you just said. Yeah. Because really what you're doing is you're engaging an entire generation in the way that they want to engage with the media that they want. The second screen experience for sports, like if real football or baseball or these other sports could do that, they'd kill it.
You're stratifying that entertainment experience. You're understanding it's not the primary feed, but it's the secondaries as well.
Right.
Yeah, they're all looking at it too, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, all the major sports now.
Yeah, sports viewership is tanking, and it's because of the millennial generation, and it's because they consume content differently, and sports hasn't responded. That wasn't my question, but I just love that comment that you made. So I was going to say that in the space that you are, once you get to a point where you're lucky enough to have an influencer who follows you and who's creating content around you, I think that the ecosystem kind of changes. I'm curious what your thoughts are, because once you get to that point, then all of a sudden you've got roles, right? You've got an influencer who needs to maintain authenticity, and you've got a company that he or she is a fanboy or fangirl of. But to maintain authenticity, they have to have criticism.
Yep.
And so therefore, no matter what you do, there's always going to be something. So you get to a point where once you've developed to that point where you've got followers and you've got influencers who are creating content around you, you absolutely need to have a relationship with them, because you need to have you need to have an ear for what they want. But at the same time, understand that there are always going to be criticisms, because that's what makes them authentic.
Yes.
And so making sure that you've got that and breed that relationship and understand that dynamic, I think that's critical. Is that something that you guys factor in your strategy?
Like part of your brand is recognizing that you're listening, and that the criticism, that's how we get better. And so the more that we can be active and not denying or silent or anything like that, when we talk about the tone of the conversation, that's what I'm referring to. So you get up, you own it. I mean, Dan said it earlier on. If you made a mistake or not, or even if you engage in a dialogue around why that's not actually the case, and they take it back and explain, hey, I was talking to the devs and they said we can't actually do this, and I kind of get it, right? So now you're building credibility through them as well. But you have to. It's a high overhead interaction. Like, you have to be there, because if you miss the right time, it again can go toxic. It can kind of build momentum in a negative way that works against you. Face it. Everything we do in entertainment is a cycle, and sometimes the biggest thing you get scared of is that you're at the top, because there's kind of one way to go from there, right? So you're constantly juggling to re-up yourself and remain relevant, and that's what the cycle looks like.
Do you always try to mitigate bad press, or is there ever any press is good press type moment?
No, not all good press is. All bad press is good press. I do think that there's always that's a tricky one. I mean, I think you have to always listen and always have to respond. I do think it's important that you have somebody dedicated to that role, that can stay objective within your company. I think that's kind of the takeaway. Somebody who's like, that is sort of there. Maybe it's more than one person, but somebody who can be that voice. I think the criticism and sometimes bad press can actually have a really bad effect on things, and it can kill projects, as we've seen.
I think the reaction, I don't think you can ever mitigate it, and I think that you can spin it sometimes in a way that is a more authentic response. It kind of goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, where we were talking about sometimes how you react to the criticism is more authentic than what people are used to, right? Because they're used to the denial. They're used to new facts being introduced that maybe aren't true. So, really, at the end of the day, the owning it is the most important part. But you want to avoid the things that you think are, not going to help you.
Yeah, I think the main thing is not to be reactive. That's the takeaway. Always take a moment, and when things like that come across, because they do. Yep. There's always going to be the moment in time where things like go completely negative, and everybody's been there in different levels and contexts. I think the only takeaway and the only thing you can really learn from that is to listen and just stay quiet sometimes and listen. But doesn't mean that you're ignoring it. And that's kind of where I think it's important to sort of take it all in first and not react in the moment.
For example, this morning my wife told me when I walked out the door, "You're not really going to wear that, are you?" And I owned it. I went back in, I changed, and here I am.
Is that what you were wearing?
Mark ended up wearing what I was going to wear.
Do you guys have any examples of insights that you gained from watching people play?
Yeah, lots. I wasn't kidding earlier.
An example.
I wasn't kidding earlier when I said that the combination of watching hours of different players play and interact with their audiences taught me more about what was working in our game than the time I spent playing it in isolation. Right? That interaction, the observations, the eyeballs of what they were doing, the things they caught. There's also a slippery slope if you're not editorializing it and you start chasing that feedback of the moment, right? It's kind of, we got to do this. We have to change the guns. We have to change the guns back. We have to change the map. We have to change the map back. I may be recanting a little bit of a journey we went through with H1Z1. So, it's you can over-index on it sometimes pretty easily. And sometimes it's just a passing storm, a passing opinion. So,
there was the first season of The Walking Dead with Telltale. Robert had a very specific mission, and that was he challenged Telltale with this, was he just wanted to make the player cry. And that was the whole point. It was like, look, if we can get this season, this story, and we can make somebody cry, and it's a gamer, then we have won. And that was the moment when there's a lot of rewrites. We worked with them very closely, especially in that first season, to get there. And so those were the moments that we were just looking for once we really started play testing the game for an audience.
Yeah, maybe. When I was playing the first couple of hours of God of War, I was actually crying, and my teenage daughter was walking past, and she was like, "Oh my God, mom's playing video games, and she's crying." So I don't know if they had that goal in mind, but that did actually happen.
Yeah, that game is phenomenal.
So I work for a consulting company, and we are currently trying to get all of our own social media and internal, reference guides and things like that kind of up and ready for our employees to use. We have 40,000 employees across the globe, and nobody likes what we have. And it's really, really hard for people in finance and consulting type positions to, I think, to contribute good input so that we can make good ideas and design these processes better. I sit on one of the pilots to help make that happen. And so what I would ask is there any good advice for trying to seek that feedback internally to make smart decisions for those users? Because we're not influenced by external parties, it's all internal for us.
You want to take that one?
I think maybe we should get Samantha to take it. Do you have an answer, Samantha? That would be so. Samantha works with us, and she actually handles all of our social media at Skybound. I would say the thing that it's a good question because we're not at that scale, and everything that we sort of focus on is the consumer. Let's see what Samantha has to say.
Hire young people.
Ah, there it is. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I know that a lot of my cohorts who've grown up, social media is part of their life's blood. But the problem is that I know some of them, see it more as fun than a job, whereas I know people who really work at it and have done it as a job for a long time. It's a very different type of mentality about the social media. So I think it is hard to find the young people who it's not just, oh, I get to do Facebook for fun and now I get to do it as a job and that's great. So I think it is hard to, narrow down which young people are going to be the right young people for the position. But I think it's finding the people with creativity. I mean, even if you think, oh, it's a finance or a consultant's social media, so it doesn't need to be a creative, they're not posting memes or, fun gifts.
Can I just
and
ask
stuff.
a question? Just because maybe it's a little unclear.
Yeah.
What is it that you're trying to achieve? Just specifically, are you trying to give your employees a handbook? I
have a paid advertisement. Hire a local UX design consultancy. We have Ben King here from Conrad and King. He has a solution for your problem.
I think the only observation I'd share on that one is that sometimes we tend to talk about topics as being ubiquitous in terms of socially connecting people and stuff like that. And what happens is that certain channels are for certain type of content. And for what you're doing, you may be forcing the wrong type of topics down the broad mainstream Instagram, Twitter kind of thing, when in actual fact, it could be Namely that has some of that functionality. It could be that, it's like LinkedIn versus Facebook. Why do they both exist? Because they're purpose-built for slightly different social interactions. And quite frankly, anybody that posts something on LinkedIn that tends to be more on Facebook gets flamed pretty quick because it's a purpose-built tool. And we use our apps in the same way. I mean, our apps are broken out in our home screen all over the place. And it's kind of and as soon as somebody tries to aggregate them all into one app, it just doesn't, it just doesn't resonate. So that may be a little bit of what you're dealing with is just people are expecting different things from certain channels and it's not matching up with their narrative.
Tim, again?
So I've got a kind of offshoot of that same question. So, he works in a consulting firm and he's got clients that don't know anything about UI UX design, right? They just know that they have a product, they need it, and people need to like it. And they're responsible for coming up with the design. Well, what if you're in a startup and you're supposed to be snazzy and you're supposed to be, that quick little race car that's maneuverable and all that stuff, sexy and all that, but you're a small team. And so the ideas that you have are the ideas that you have. How do you, as a small company, and I know that you guys are bigger than that, but as you're being nimble and you're trying to grow, how do you inject inspiration that can lead to that beautiful expression of UI and UX that users love. And then, by the way, I spent a lot of time in the financial industry, and I can tell you that for a user experience in financial software, in terms of role-based, single sign-on is a huge help, because the single sign-on will allow you to identify what role somebody is, and therefore you have different personas of UX that you provide for the different levels based on their single sign-on environment. So,
yeah, that's
anyway.
a good point. Yep.
I mean, I think the simplifying things down to its core is the key. I think we talked a little bit about this before we sat up here, which is trying to simplify the message. I think if we look at just the games industry and sort of this trend of where all these games have sort of emerged, the one thing that's consistent is a lot of them are pulling from what mobile introduced in gaming several years ago, which is the UI, UX in these games. And the one thing that's consistent, it's such an important part of games now, the UI, UX is almost everything for a game. Because if you can't get a player in like 5 seconds and express to them exactly what this experience is going to be, and then let them keep coming back, that game loop, they'll disappear, they'll be gone, and then probably never come back.
There's been a huge shift in UI UX learning within the games. Going back to early console times, the resolution of the screens were PlayStation 1. Resolution of the screens weren't great. 640 by 480 is all you had, and you were trying to minimize button presses. That was kind of the design mantra. Give people as much information as they can get on the screen to make decisions and get into the game, so that you don't have as many button presses. Then you turn around and you look at where mobile is, and it didn't work. You couldn't get a lot of information on the screen because the touchable space was so small for the buttons. Most of the early games were horribly dense in terms of trying to navigate them, because those principles were being applied to the mobile interface. What were the apps that were excelling on mobile? They were one question at a time, and they were ruthless in terms of not having a lot of information you could get, because there's only so many steps people would go through. So what you're seeing now is that same mentality is being brought back to console and PC, that people aren't going to push through the friction. They're being programmed to consume their digital content with this much patience. So all those game designs that said, no, they'll just power through it, make it harder, right? That doesn't work anymore. You have to spoon feed it. You have to personalize it. You have to have multiple paths to use case, to one log in them. Down the path that gets them to their optimal sweet spot of serotonin and having that response and connecting with your game and continuing.
Yeah. I think there's companies out there that specialize in this now, and you may know them. I mean, we often are game companies that partners that don't always know the answer to that. I think the main thing is to know what is that experience you want your player to have in the first 30 seconds, and then really be able to define what is it that you're trying to make. And what is it? How do you just think of yourself from the consumer standpoint and put a stopwatch on is the key. And really understanding what is this product, why do people need it, or why do they want to play it? It's not that much different. And then there's companies out there that they're experts in really helping a team, and small teams too, kind of visualize that and create those designs. So you don't have to have all of it internal, is my point. There's a lot of different companies now that have been coming out of mobile that are that are great, that can do that for you.
And as good as that experience and knowledge is, if you recognize that even with the best planning and you need to test it, you're not going to get it right. You'll get close, but where you will validate where the sweet spot is and learn more about where your audience is and what you need to give up is when you, as early as you possibly can, get it in the hands of people that are going to use it. And Elena set up our UX lab, and it was infinitely valuable in terms of us getting feedback and really closing the loop on where the sweet spot was.
Yeah, I mean, people in the games industry back in the olden days, they used to do focus tests. Yep. And that was always built around the marketing, of like how they're going to message the marketing. It's like those days are long gone. Yep. I mean, you have to be testing the product all the way through development.
And this is where the data hooks come in, and different scales of testing and what you're looking for. It's all of it. Like user experience is all those steps. And so sometimes I think we get a little caught in design paralysis and wanting to get it perfectly right. And the more we free ourselves up to recognize that we just need to get close, so that once we get it out there, we have time to then get it right. You don't feel as judged because it's part of the accepted process.
I got a leading question for you.
All right. This is going to be actually our last question. I hope that our speakers might be able to hang out for a little bit after we wrap up. What? Oh, is the beer finished, or there is still a lot of beer? There might be some pizza. I don't know about that, but beer, yes. So, Ian.
In light of the recent ArenaNet incident, I think you might have heard about that. Do you have any sort of thoughts on sort of the risk calculus of pushing back when an influencer is sort of a source of toxicity, like for the sake of the employees and the rest of the community and stuff like that?
Maybe if you can summarize what happened, because a lot of people in the audience might not know.
Should I, or? Yeah. So there was an incident where an influencer got into a tiff with a developer at ArenaNet, and as a result of her popping off on him, she and another employee who defended her were fired from ArenaNet.
Are you familiar with the story?
In that context, at that level of detail, I didn't go into it in detail, but we've had our own experiences of employees being active in the community, and quite frankly, because they're using their personal identities, it was really rough on them when things kind of went a little sideways. There's some pretty mean people out there within some of these circles, and if you're susceptible to taking it too seriously or wrapping too much of your personal identity up in that, it becomes a personal attack. And depending on the individual and their training and maturity and stuff like that, you lash back. People tend to protect themselves. As a company, we need to protect our employees. So it starts with social media training and an understanding of what you're doing with what voice and what to react to and what not to react to. It's almost counseling based to a certain degree. But I really feel like we have a responsibility to prepare people for what it is this environment represents, and be thoughtful with regards to, I had many conversations with some people and have reassigned them to other teams because they were getting too embedded within that, and it was too personal. It was weighing on them. You could see it in their body language. It's kind of like, this isn't going to end well. This is too close. So it's a real thing, and it's that's an example of where I think they probably reacted the wrong way.
Yeah, I think that is to echo that. That is it was a sad event. It really, because I think it could have been something that may have been avoidable, but you never know. I wasn't there. I wasn't part of that, and I think there's both sides have valid arguments. I think the point is it should never get to that level. As a game company, you are the one that is your consumer, and it's important to recognize that your fans are what make the product. And now that said, it doesn't excuse bad behavior, and there's lots of it, and people they're anonymous, so they feel empowered often to say whatever they want, and oftentimes they don't even believe it. I think that's sort of the takeaway, is that oftentimes people are, they like to say things to get a reaction, and that's why it's important. I kind of mentioned this. I think it's important to have somebody that's objective, on the front lines, and oftentimes the people who are so embedded in the product as the creators, the developers, are, they're vulnerable.
Yep.
All right, we might have a very, very quick question that will take a super, super quick answer. Consistency, but let's...
This smells of a plant.
This could be a plant, but
there you go.
let's keep it super quick, because I'm sure people are quick, thirsty and everything. So,
sure, thank you. I wanted to ask, since these super influencers are creating a brand for themselves and self-promoting through a lot of the activity that they're having, how can you take their words seriously or give it any sort of value, since they are promoting themselves through the feedback that they're providing to the games?
What you're describing is exactly what the ecosystem is. They are in it to create their brand and ideally make a living at it, and we have to take them seriously, enable them to do it. It's actually in our best interest. So, when I mentioned earlier on that within the last number of years, there's been a shift in our industry, at least for me, in the context of awareness around that we're not just making the game for the person that's playing the game, but there's another category of person that's creating content out of our game. And whether it's canned content that they're putting up on YouTube or whether it's live content, it doesn't really matter. We have to provide the tools because it's in our best interest to allow them to propagate virality and virally that content for discovery.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other way to look at it is just to embrace it and then celebrate it in a sense, because this is the moment in time where games have suddenly, I'm biased, but have taken over. And that is, when I say that, they've taken over as the primary form of entertainment. And it is just that, it's entertainment. And so we're competing not just about games, we're competing against all entertainment. And games, more and more so, are not just created to be played, but they're actually, you have to keep in mind that they're created to be watched. And so those people who are playing them, oftentimes there's a whole multiple behind those people that are a fan of that behavior, not necessarily of the game. So you have to sort of just give that up, and I think that's not a bad thing to actually empower these people, because I kind of mentioned this in the beginning, they are creators, and oftentimes like I know plenty of kids, and my nieces, they all sort of look up to these people who are playing the game, and the game is kind of secondary, which is okay, because really it's meant to be played and meant to be enjoyed and meant to be watched, and ultimately that's what you're there for.
I think I'm going to just quickly jump into that question. Ninja, basically, as I started off with that movie that you started with, has generated over $50 million worth of earned media to the game Fortnite. So he's promoting his own brand, but at the same time, he's adding a lot of value to the Fortnite brand as well by what the earned media generated.
All right, let's wrap it up, and let's give a huge round of applause for Larry and Dan.